Hey everybody, welcome back to the Advanced Kayak Angler podcast. Podcast name I can't even say. With me, co-host Kurt Smits. What's up, dude?
How's it going, man?
Good. How you doing? You've been out fishing, huh?
Yeah, man. This is one of my favorite times of year to go fishing, man. I switch up species and start heading down to the Ohio River and start chasing some hybrids and saugeye and whatever else I can get to bite on the river.
Heck yeah, man. Cool. Did have one thing to go over this week. I'll present it here. We had. You'd figure I'd be prepared. Share screen. Hobie. There we go. The big tournament that we had this week was the Hobie BOS on Lake Chickamauga, and just want to say congrats first, Ewing Minor Angler of the Year. Congrats to him. Brady Stores ended up winning it with 256 and a quarter. Jordan Marshall, old Kingfisher teammate, with 251 3/4, and I know he had a tough time. He was leading after day two and he was disappointed, but Justin Largen in third. I went back and listened to him and Bailey's. They have that new podcast called uh, Kayak Fishing Weekly. Good podcast, obviously. Bailey, serious angler, he's going to put out a great podcast. But Justin was talking about how he had had pretty low expectations. He didn't think the event was going to set up well for him. So I know he's got to be disappointed after that day too. But still, to end in third, you got to be happy with that, right?
Yeah, that's pretty darn good. And the tournament
Yeah.
of champions, I mean, it's
Just to
literally the
make it.
best people in the country fishing.
Yeah. Yeah, just to be there is like you've you've had a big accomplishment just to qualify for it. So everybody keep your head up. In 10th, I think 10th place, Jackson Orr got like 10th and he's still got a big check. So yeah, man. Great event.
It was
And
exciting, man. I watched it all day, and it was like back and forth over the
yeah.
3 days. It really changed. It was an exciting event.
That really I gotta say it might have been my favorite event to follow on. I mean, I was really just kind of glued to Tourney X. Seems like all 3 days. So yeah, good on
Yeah.
them. Cool. Well, this week we're talking about the mysterious drop shot, which I have like a love hate relationship. I used to throw it all the time, and then this year I was talking about with my buddy Chuck. I didn't catch one dang fish this year on a drop shot, not one. So I don't know. Thinking about trying to get that back into the rotation for 2024. So we got two unbelievably great drop shot anglers that I put on my Facebook, and people said these were the dudes. So we got Nick Audi and Tim Kazmierski. What's up, guys?
Hey Dan,
How's
thanks
it
for having
going?
us on.
Good. Thank y'all for being on. I don't know if y'all have been on this podcast before, but we'll give you a chance to tell everybody who you are. Tom, we'll start with you, man.
Tom Kazmierski, live in Kennesaw, Georgia. Uh, about 3 years in with kayak fishing, fished out of a boat most of my life. Uh, Started drop shot fishing back in probably 99 or 2000.
Wow.
Yeah, I got lucky and went out west with a guy and got some lessons. And like any new bait on the scene, it was amazing back then and definitely tougher with time as pressures hit. But love kayak fishing. Been in it, like I said, been in it for 3 years, and man, I love it. I love pedaling, motoring around, whatever we're doing in kayaks, rivers, lakes. It's really been a great experience. I'm truly into the kayak thing.
Do you do you still have a boat, or did you give up on it altogether?
Not, life, kids, sports, and
Yeah.
wasn't using as much, sitting in the garage. And I was like, I sold it, and Jamie and those guys at the dugout got back into. Jamie's like, hey, we're starting kayak. I was like, okay. He's like, I want you in it. I'm like, okay. So that's what brought me into it. At first, it was. I mean, it's a lot of learning curves. Mad respect for the guys that have been doing it for a long time. It's such a there's so many things in a kayak you can't do in a boat, like carry
Yeah.
15 rods. So it's it was a culture shock, but it's really kind of narrowed down to, bringing the rods that matter and making an area work, which in a bass boat you never had to do. You could, just run 70 miles an hour this way or that way. So it's a lot tougher, but I think it creates a really good angler. So loving
For
it.
sure. Yeah, I came from a bass boat. I don't until I can't pedal or anything anymore. I don't think I'm going back. Like I enjoy it too much. So,
Same here. I
yeah.
Yeah.
have no intention of owning a boat ever again.
Amen. All right, Nick, dude. I don't know how many people on Facebook said you were the man with a drop shot. So you got all them trophies behind you. Tell everybody who you are. I'm in the
Yeah.
Northeast. Northeast, they already know, but
Yeah. So I'm Nick Audi, and I'm from northeastern Pennsylvania. I've been fishing out of a kayak since 2015, but really only got into tournaments in 2020. Used to just fish, local ponds in northeastern Pennsylvania, and ever since I started fishing kayak tournaments in 2020, it's just opened the door for me in terms of how many amazing fisheries there are in the Northeast, but also just all over the country. I mean, I've traveled all over the country fishing. So basically, my big style of fishing is drop shot fishing. I love it. It's my favorite way to fish, and I kind of call it the control. Like if drop shot is not working, then I don't even try to really go to anything else. That's like what I see. That I go to a drop shot when I see if I need to get a bite, and that's I target fish deep, shallow. I mean, anywhere you could think. I've caught fish from on Caddo Lake down in Texas in 2 feet of water, throwing a drop shot into a laydown, pulling an 8-pounder out of a laydown, all the way to 50, 60 feet up on some of these northern lakes, super deep, clear water, smallmouth. I think it applies pretty much across the board. So
we're talking to the right people.
It sounds like it.
Yeah. All right. So I guess we'll start with baits. That sound good, Kurt?
Yeah,
What do you
absolutely.
think? All right.
yeah. So I actually
So
have a few here.
it sounds like you throw like everything from power shot to the other
Yeah.
end, which is the ultra finesse, right?
Yeah, and I really I feel like my favorite style of drop shot fishing is open, deep, clear water. That's my favorite way to fish a drop shot. If it's smallmouth in the summer, anytime from June all the way through, it's actually funny in the winter it starts to tail off, but in from June until November, I'm throwing a drop shot if I'm targeting smallmouth. That's pretty much my favorite way to go. And just starting with some of the baits I have. I mean, obviously I have a couple here. Maxent #1, Berkeley Maxent flatworm.
Accent guy.
Absolutely #1. It's not even a question. It's my #1. The second one that I actually throw.
Why the flatworm?
Gets bit? I mean,
Flavor. It's got flavor.
yeah. I don't know so much if it's the scent. It's just something about it that it just works. I mean, I try other lures, and I feel like honestly, most of the time, I would say it gets bit 2-1 over other drop shot lures that you're
2
throwing,
to 1.
especially on northern smallmouth. Now, for largemouth, I actually don't find that I throw it that much. That would be I throw a robo worm for largemouth 99% of the time if I'm targeting largemouth on a drop shot. This is one of the colors I throw.
The 4.5
So the
or
6-inch straight tail. And this is one of the colors I throw. It's bitch and craw. Then there's another one, tequila sunrise. They're my two. If I want a more natural presentation, if I feel like they're on shad, I'll go to this one. In the spring, in particular, I think that the tequila sunrise really is the color to go to. That's kind of a red and purple color. Any kind of those morning dawn colors. But those. So the way I break it down, basically, largemouth and smallmouth, I have 2 different drop shot setups depending on which species I'm targeting, where I'm throwing it. So
Now, are you fishing structure? Are you
Yeah.
like looking for stuff to fish with the drop shot, or are you kind of fishing more open water with it?
Yeah, so in the springtime, it's one of my go-to tactics for largemouth, pre-spawn largemouth is fishing dock posts with the drop shot. I tend to target the back to middle dock posts. Like if there's like 3 rows of posts on a typical dock, I'll target the back to the middle one. And I kind of feel like the dock in and of itself represents the staging areas of these largemouth. In the beginning, they may not be on beds yet. They're going to be out towards the end. it could be colder. They could slide off to deeper water. As the water warms up, they might slide up, and then eventually they're going to be spawning. A lot of times you'll see just right on the back dock post, like up shallow. So I'm casting to the back and just slowly dragging the drop shot out. I don't throw that heavy of a weight when I'm targeting docks. Quarter is like my max. But 3/16, 1/8, depending just on how deep the dock is. But most of the time, if I'm fishing for largemouth, it's going to be docks. There's some special different circumstances you could get into up here where you could target largemouth out deep, but most of the time it's going to be shallow or cover.
So with the flatworm, do you think it's specifically like because it's kind of got that dull, muted color to it, or it's the max scent, or the the motion of it, the size? What is it? Just a combination, you think?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure, but it could just be a profile thing. I mean, I know that the KVD Dream Shot gets bit pretty good as well, and that's another one that has that flat bottom with the rounded tops with the kind of the, I don't know, ribbing going down the bait profile. It could just be that flat bottom. I don't know what it is, but it gets bit.
Tom, how about you, man? Oh, sorry.
You're good. You're good.
I've fished it about every way known to man. What Nick said, a lot of that holds true for me. I've caught them in off bed on a drop shot. When you find a really finicky fish, sometimes that's the bait that gets it done for you. I've caught them, I live in the South, so we got spotted bass. I've caught them out of 80 foot of water on a drop shot. I look at the worms I throw, and I won't even get into brands, but I mean, I've got a long worm here. And this is like a purple brown. I don't know what the color's called. That's PB&J, but this to me is more of a warm weather type. I'm looking for certain water temperatures to be throwing a worm like this, because sitting on the hook, I mean, you see the action of a longer worm. Same with Robo. I used to throw a lot of Robos. I liked them better when they were hand poured. When they became a conglomerate, they started injecting them, and they're a little tougher. And then I go down to like some small little worms like this. This is a crush worm by Netbait. It's flat. It's still got quite a bit of action. I'll even actually go to a like in the Max Scent, they make those. I think it's a 4-inch Cinco that's kind of stiff. And it depends on the area you're in. I'm not real familiar with the true north, but what I've seen of bass, each one, spot, largemouth, smallmouth, they kind of have temperature ranges where they really start shutting down. Like spotted bass for me is like right around 48 degrees is when they start becoming really lethargic. So a bait with little to no action is what I'm looking for. I don't want it sitting there fluttering in their face. I want it just sitting there, look like an easy meal. They're cold. They don't want to move a lot. So they'll go up there and eat that bait. I've seen smallmouth, to me, on the big lakes, which Dale Hollow is about as far north as I have experience on. But when Dale Hollow gets down around 45, 44, 43, those fish get the same way. They want to, I want a stiffer, harder bait that's not going to give a lot of action. And largemouth, anything below 48 is death for me. It's rare to catch them when it gets much below that, at least here in the South. I kind of look at the water temperatures and how actively I think they're going to be targeting a bait. So I think in bass fishing, a lot of us, like I used to go for a worm that I felt like just poured on the hook. It was the softest bait possible. But I use water temperatures as my judge as to how much action I want in the bait. When I'm fishing shallow, I'm using lighter weight drop shots. If I'm fishing a bedfish, I got a 1/2 ounce drop shot weight on. In the wintertime when I'm fishing, I'm throwing a 1/2 ounce all day long. But I came from the boat world. I still treat it the same in the kayak world. I'm using my sonar. So whether it's forward facing, which we have now, but I'll go back to 2D. When I saw, a group of fish, especially in 30 foot of water or whatever, I don't think, a lot of anglers realize how much in a kayak, especially how much you move away from what you just drew on the image of that graph. So I want to put it on their head. It's kind of like, I look at it kind of like a spoon, but I'm not going to, rip it up and down in front of their face. I'm going to sit it there. I've won a big tournament on Lake Kiwi years ago. We caught all our fish out of 80 foot of water. And
I've never caught a bass in 80 feet.
yeah, we had almost 19 pounds of spots. And
Wow.
literally, I don't know if it was dumb luck how we figured this out. I don't even remember. But we found just a little ditch in 80 foot of water. The spots were holding so tight to the bottom that you basically had to take your 2D sonar and zoom all the way in to just see little lumps, and come to find out they were spots. We figured that out later. But we would basically, like, my distance from my weight to my worm there was probably 6 inches. And you would drop it down there and not move it. And all of a sudden you'd feel a thump, and you'd kind of feel it move a little bit and, load up. I think a lot of people, it depends on how you fish your drop shot. I think there's a lot of guys still using open hook, like a nose hook style. That's how I started. If the bait permits, size wise, everything I do now is weedless. I'm using a little stiffer rod, kind of a medium heavy. It's got enough tip so they don't fill you, but I want to set the hook. I think that's where a lot of guys struggle with drop shot is, back in the early days, everything was nose hook. I don't think there were many guys, weedless rigging it at all. And the first lake I ever fished it on was Lake Havasu. And it was so hard for me to feel a bite and not jerk. It's like the buzzbait. You got to look away so you can catch that buzzbait fish. But that was kind of, and then I got into playing around with the technique and everything. And I basically I kind of rigged one up in case people want to see, but I went to this is an owner. There's quite a few companies out there that make them. I'm not really sponsored by anybody, but it's got a weed guard on there. You can put the worm on there, and then you can weedless, skin hook it like you would a normal Texas rig. I got a piece of braid on here. One of the big things I think guys maybe don't do in drop shotting, and I don't even know if you can see this, but that hook's laying all kinds of awkward right now. I tie a polymer knot on mine, but if you'll run that line back through the eye, that hook will stand straight up, and then your bait can, whether you're fishing current, it's just got a little bit of natural. There's a lot more movement going on. Like guys that sit there and do this, there's a lot of movement going on without you doing any of that. I've caught drop shot fish just basically holding it there, on a school of fish. And, I think in kayak world, reading your Facebook post today, like, guys are like, what's a drop shot? I fished a drop shot in brush piles on my home lake and won tons of money fishing brush piles with 12 and 15 pound test fluorocarbon. But I was able to put my drop shot in the brush pile and just sit there and hold it on a limb and just dangle it. And whether it's what got me the bites or not, who knows, but it was a confidence thing for me. And especially like a lot of times when I'm bed fishing, if they're not real line shy, by all means, I'll put it on a 15 pound test bait caster and, put a bigger hook in there and lay the wood to them. I think a lot of people think it's a finesse tactic, and it is. Like if you hate a spoon and you struggle in the wintertime, tie on a drop shot. It's going to increase your bites. It's things, better things are going to happen. But for the guys that, I don't own any spinning rods, I'm a bait caster guy or whatever. like Lake Seminole, I've done it down there before in the timber, and I mean, there's big bass. I think possibly guys watching the show, but there's some Bassmaster events that have been won on Lake Seminole on a drop shot.
Cifuentes this year.
What's that?
Joey Cifuentes this year won it on a drop shot. But I
So,
remember watching the old ones with like Brett Height back in
Yep.
like 2000 fishing
Yep.
Seminole. Yeah, some of his old Bassmaster episodes.
Yeah, cold front comes in and the fish
Mhm.
are finicky. It's Florida strain, so they're definitely get funky when a cold front hits. I think being able to put that bait in their face and hold it there. There's days where it's on fire. I've my home lake here. I mean, I've caught 60, 70, 80 bass a day on it, where every point you pull up to 20 foot deep, drop shot down, you'll catch 4 or 5, go to the next one until the school gets broken up. Chick used to be that way years ago in the early, when Chick was like amazing, probably about 10 years ago. But when all the guys were going out on the ledges throwing big crankbaits, we would go out there with drop shots and we would bust 20, 25 pound sacks. Actually throwing a red crawler robo worm back then. So there's a lot of ways.
Yeah. What about swim baits? Is that something that y'all ever, like I see, people like for suspended fish, they talk about pendulum the bait back to you where it's swimming.
Yeah.
Are y'all ever throwing a swim bait on there, or is it just some kind of worm?
I've done it a lot at I actually one event on Lake Chateau. It was the only way I could get them to bite, but I would throw a drop shot, out to way past the fish and just click the bail and let it pendulum back to them with a Kitech on it. I mean,
Yeah.
It works. To me, it's one of the most versatile styles of fishing. So many people think it's a spinning rod with light line, and it's not. Obviously, in the ultra clear lakes, getting down to, if you use a good fluorocarbon and 6-pound test, it works. But you can also go to any of your lakes with a lot of structure. And I mean, you see these techniques coming out now where, and I don't know what they're called, but you see that, that big hook with the wire coming down and a big heavy weight. I mean, that's how I've been doing a drop. Yeah, there you go. So I've been doing that with a drop shot for years. There's a lot of different ways you can do, I guess skin a cat,
So I got a question for both you guys. How are you guys determining your length between the weight and your bait?
So for me up north, when I'm fishing up north, a lot of times, so I'm using my electronics too, mostly live sonar, and I could see the drop shot. You could see your 2 returns on the screen. You'll see your drop shot going down, and then you'll see your weight below it. And I notice a lot of times I will see the fish head for the weight, and instead of the top. So you have 2 marks falling down. You see your drop shots on the top, the weight's on the bottom. If you see the fish go for the bottom one, I lengthen the distance between my drop shot and my hook, my drop shot weight and my hook. I run very long leaders between my drop shot and my hook. I'm running like sometimes upwards of 2 feet between the weight and the lure. But again, I do when I'm fishing, like if I'm fishing structure for largemouth or something down south, I shorten that up because I think you want the lure as closer to the bottom or closer to the piece of the structure that you're fishing.
As holy awkward cast, Batman. That'd be tough.
I agree with Nick. I mean, I think a lot of times the fish will tell you. I mean, the weight trick's kind of money. I mean, that works 9 times out of 10 if they're chasing that weight. If you'll separate that bait from the weight, a lot of times you'll get more bites.
Garrett Morgan was on a couple of months ago, and he was putting for his weight on the bottom. He was putting a jig, and he was catching them on both.
Yeah,
it works. It's just tough
and expensive.
Yeah. Well, I think you truly at that point got to go weedless on your, on your top, your worm, right? Because if you got the jig down there, you got to be able to set the hook.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
you gotta jerk at that point. It's not a, the old days of, like, if you're using an open hook, nose hooking a bait, a lot of times at that point you wait for the rod to load up and you just start reeling, and that's the
Yeah.
hardest thing for a lot of guys. They want to set the hook on that.
Right.
I had a hard time with it. That's why I got away from it, and I feel like I hook a lot more fish
Yeah.
the way I do
I
it
was
now.
running into some of the same problems that you were having with the nose hook, and I don't run a nose hook
Yeah.
anymore. I actually used a similar hook to what you're using, but it's a VMC Nico Finesse. So I
Yep.
thread the bait on the hook like that. And I
Good
feel
way of
like
doing
it
it.
puts the hook further back on the lure. So if you do have a fish that's shy about biting the whole lure, you increase your chances of a hookup, just getting the hook further back. And then also you have the effect of it standing on the line better than a nose hooked worm.
Yep.
I think that's a big part of the presentation, because and you asked about Maxent earlier. Maxent doesn't float very good at all. If you ever
No, it
put a
sinks like a rock.
Maxent, yeah, if you ever put Maxent on a nose hook and you just don't do anything and there's no current really or anything, the lure will just hang there like that. Like, it's not a very great looking presentation. So having it on a hook where you have more support in the actual weight or in the actual worm helps it stand up straighter and get that effect that you're looking for.
What size hook are you using? Like a 1?
So this is a number 2 Nico
2.
Finesse hook. But in that owner hook that I think it's the cover shot, the owner cover shot.
Cover shot. Yeah, it is. You're right.
I've been messing around with that a little bit. I bought the number 2 originally, trying to make it. I thought it was going to be a very similar size to this, and the number 2 is a little bit small for most of the presentations I'm using. So I would use a size 1 in the owner cover shot.
Yeah, I use a 2/0, 3/0, a 4.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of hooks, if you're talking drop shot and hook, to simplify it for everybody, match your bait. That's how any hook I pick out of my box. I don't care if I'm throwing a Texas rig, if I'm throwing a little worm on it and it's got a lot of plastic, I'm going to use a wider gap, or whatever the case. Just match your bait on your hooks, depending on how you're going to rig it. And your softer baits, you can get away with a lot smaller hook. There's not as much hand pores as there used to be, but unfortunately, I think a lot of those guys didn't make it. But there used to be a lot of great hand pores out of California, and I guess like North Central. I used to have a couple of guys that would hand pour up there, and they would make worms that were like jelly. I mean, they would almost melt off the hook when you put it on there. You didn't even have to penetrate the worm. You could just bury it in the worm as deep as you wanted, and it would hook every single fish. Now it's a one fish worm, which a lot of guys hate, but
right,
if you're catching, you're catching.
Yep. Yeah. So the other worm that I actually go to a lot, and it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum of the softest worm, is it's the Spro CJ Smasher. It's sort of like an Elastec worm. It's like that stretchy. It's not Z-Man, but it's a material like that. And the benefit to that is, if you're on a really good drop shot bite up north, I mean, it's nothing to catch 100 fish in a day. So you don't want to be you don't want to be taking the time. A lot of times you have schooling fish under you and you're trying to keep the school going by catching one after another. You don't want to have to take the time to rethread that worm every time. So I'll go to something like that, and you catch 30 fish on those, and they're still in pretty good shape.
Wow.
Yeah.
I guess my biggest problem with the drop shot is I don't know. It kind of blurs a line, but for me, because I'm thinking more the finesse, not the power shot, like, Nico, weighted wacky, drop shot, shaky head. How is it just, Nick, it sounds like, since that's your go-to, that's what you're going to throw first before the other ones. But how do you if you weren't that way, how do you decide which one to throw in which situation? It seems like they kind of overlap so much in the drop shot. Like to me, it would be if I'm trying to stay, there's a muck bottom, or I'm trying to stay above a weed line, or, I'm fishing vertical.
Yeah.
Those would be the situations I would think. But what situations are y'all seeing where that's a drop shot?
So for me, I usually always go drop shot because it's so efficient. There's no more efficient finesse technique than a drop shot because I'm using, like, if I'm fishing how I normally fish, I'm throwing a 3/4 ounce drop shot weight. The thing, it falls like literally it just gets down to the fish fast. So that, like, if I want to take my time to float something down to the fish, float a Ned rig down to them, hang a Demiki over their head, something like that, that's real finesse fishing to me. That a drop shot to me is not finesse fishing. A drop shot is crashing. It's almost like punching. Like when I'm out in 30, 40 feet of water, I'm using sometimes an ounce drop shot weight, and I picture the water as a mat. It's literally like I'm punching to get these fish. It's a power technique for me. I'm getting the lure down to the fish as fast as possible, trying to elicit that reaction strike from them. And as the weight is falling and crashing past them, it actually creates a reaction strike. The fish will just bite it because it's in their mouth before they even know what happened. And then I'm not really throwing light line when I'm throwing a drop shot. I'm throwing 12, sometimes even 15-pound line if I think that I could get away with it. And that's not even just dirty water. That's crystal clear water. I'm throwing 12 to 15-pound line, and I'm getting them in the boat as fast as possible. That's my goal when I'm throwing a drop shot. It's more of a power fishing technique for me, which sounds crazy, I know, but that's how I fish it.
I find that really interesting that both of you guys are using a lot heavier line than I was expecting to hear from the drop shot guys. You know what I mean? The drop
Yeah.
shot experts. You guys are running significantly heavier line.
Yeah. The
No,
only time
I've used a bunch of different sizes, but I mean, it's all about the fish. There's times when it matters. A
yeah.
high pressured lake, uh, I will go down to 6 in a heartbeat if I feel
Yeah.
like there's been some big tournaments on a lake like that. But like especially what Nick's talking about, that's exactly how I think of it is, sending a bait down. There's so many times when you click over and engage the reel and the rod's already loading up because you just threw that bait on their face. And I don't think people realize, and I think it's 1,000 times worse than a kayak because we drift around like a I mean, we're like a kite out there. But what you see on your graph, being able to, especially when you're fishing 20, 30, 40, 50 foot deep, you got to get it on their head. And I used to watch, I mean, even in a bass boat, but having a graph at the console in the front with young kids, I would watch their bait come on the back graph, which was, the transducer was mounted by the motor. And I'm like, reel up, put it back down. Because they would come out there with 1/4 ounce or 3/16, and I'd be like, let me see your drop shot. And I'd put a half or a 3/8 on there, and I'd like, now drop it on their head. And they'd start catching. I mean, some of it's, it's no different than, like, I mean, Nick said it perfectly. You're punching a mat, but it's open, deep water mat. You're just trying to put a lure, especially a smallmouth. I mean, we've all watched the videos where something just comes down in front of their face and their first reaction is to, and if
Yeah.
it tastes good and it's, they're hungry, they're going to hold on to it and you're going to catch them.
And when I find largemouth out deep, some of the local lakes near me have started spraying grass, like trying to kill the grass off for whatever reason. I noticed that a lot of largemouth, they start acting like smallmouth. They'll be out there chasing bait, which I've never seen before they started spraying the grass. They really don't have anywhere to go, so they just go out and start chasing alewives or shad, whatever's in your lake around. And the largemouth, when they get in that mentality, it's the same type of bite. It's not that smallmouth, I don't think, I mean, yeah, sure, they're a more aggressive species generally, but largemouth
Right.
will bite too. Like I've caught plenty of largemouth out deep doing the same thing, rocketing a drop shot past their head. And then there's days where they don't want to bite on the fall. And what you do on those kind of days is kind of, Tom, like you were saying earlier, it's almost like you're suspending it. You have to play with the drop shot. Like you can watch it on your electronics to elicit a strike, whether that's letting it fall past their head and then quickly reeling up, or you are holding it there and seeing if they'll come up to it, sort of like a Demiki rig bite. It's just and especially when I'm using 3/4 ounce drop shot weight, line management is everything because you need to be able to know where your drop shot is in the water column at any given time. You can't just let it float freely out there. It's you like when you're casting, you have to hold your line, make sure it hits the water right so it falls perfectly straight down, so you can really gauge where your drop shot is at in the water column.
Yeah, the heavier weight, especially for guys that haven't, I mean, guys that are struggling fishing deep, which a lot of guys in the South do, I think, they're having to learn by force because they're going to get beat to death in the colder months if they don't learn it. But, I fish a worm, I fish a jig the same way. I always tell, like people that I've taken out fishing and when I'm fishing myself, I fish the lightest possible weight I can feel on a jig. And I fish like at Dale Hollow. I fish up there a ton. I love that lake. It's the best
Beautiful
experience I
place.
get in.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the best I get of smallmouth fishing. Unfortunately, I'd love to go further north, but like guys are like, are you using a half-ounce jig and I if the wind's not blowing, I'm using a quarter, but I can manage my line and feel it all the way back to the boat. There's nothing wrong though with I've had, guys in the boat with me that didn't know what they were really doing. And I'm like, let me tie on a heavier jig. And I'm like, now you're on the bottom. Click your bail every so often. Make sure you're on the bottom. A lot of guys, in the cooler months, especially down here in the South, their bait's not on the bottom or it's not, they're like,
Where it should
they're
be.
almost doing that pendulum thing, which when they get that bite, they're confused because they don't know why they got it anyways. But, it's with the heavier weight, especially Nick talking about like a 2-foot leader. I do that a lot with a 2-foot leader, especially when you think about practicing for a tournament and you're sitting there on a wad of fish and you're watching them chase your bait up and down or whatever. They're not committing, right? And these are the fish that like frustrate me. These are the ones I truly want to figure out how to make bite. The easy ones are easy. But it's figuring out how to make these tougher schools of fish fire and get them to bite. But when you have that 2 feet from there to your weight, and especially with like the max scent worms, like he was talking about, they're heavier. Sometimes I'll put a Cinco on because I know a Cinco's heavily salted and they'll fall. Some of the smaller Cincos. But you can start up here at 2 feet and kind of watch what the fish do on your graph. And with that heavy weight, you can pull the worm up until you feel the weight, knowing that your line's fully stretched at 2 feet, and then let it fall back down and kind of, just slackline it and then watch your graph and kind of start learning where the bite is. That's how you dial in to where you're constantly targeting the bite zone of the fish. I mean, it's a fish. It's got a mind of its own. It'll do whatever. But a lot of times I've seen it like on Lanier, there's a ton of drop shotting that's gone on over the years there. There's times where, you rip it up and let it fall back down and that's your bite. Sometimes it's on the initial fall. Sometimes it's just holding it there steady, not moving it. Sometimes it's that slack fall, that real natural fall. And, you think about a Nico rig, everybody loves throwing, Nicos and stuff like that, right? Well, how do you throw a Nico rig in 30 foot of water? You drop shot. You put a 2-foot leader on there, put the same, put a heavy salted bait or something like a max scent that is going to fall good and let that bait, give the same presentation as if you were fishing it in 6 foot of water on a grass line. It's a similar concept. It's just a different way of doing it and getting bit.
When do you throw a wacky rig drop shot, if at all?
I
don't ever.
Really.
I've talked to Derek Brundle throws that a little bit. He's talked about that being something that's effective for him. But I've never honestly, I can't say it doesn't work one way or the other just because I really haven't tried it. It's not something that I play around with much.
Yeah, it's not. I weedless Texas rig, basically whatever you want to call that. That's how I do every single drop shot I throw. If I'm throwing a drop shot, it'll be a weedless hook of some sort.
Yep. And I thread every drop shot I throw, except for when I'm fishing structure, and then I will weedless rig like Tom is saying. If I'm fishing
Right.
grass clumps or something like that, if it calls for a weedless rig, I'll throw that. But besides that, I'm using the same hook, just threading it on as opposed to weedless. And he's right. I mean, it is a hook set. It is not like you don't like you don't lean into a drop shot fish. And I could go to the rod that I'm using. I throw a G
Yeah, please do.
Loomis. Yeah, I throw a G Loomis NRX. I throw the 822 drop shot rod when I'm throwing like lighter hooks, lighter presentations, maybe a little bit lighter bait. And then I'm throwing an 842 spin jig rod that's just a little bit longer. That's my favorite drop shot rod. And I'm setting the hook. Like it is a full, like you're almost like you're setting the hook on a jig. It's a hook set. And a
Yeah.
lot of times the fish are either directly below me or 30 to 50 feet out in front of me. So it's not like they're way far out there. Sometimes they are, but it's more of a vertical hook set, like that, as opposed to a traditional like sweeping jig hook set.
Yeah, I'm with Nick. A 2 power is about as light as I go. And a spinning rod. I use NRX's same rod you just said. The only other one I use, and I'll do it in like we've got some lakes here that are tough, high pressured lakes. But if I'm brush fishing and I can't get the bait casters, I can't put a bait caster in these brush piles like I want to. I'll go to a 3 power, which is typically what I throw like a jig or something on a spinning rod or a shaky head. I like a 3 power rod, especially in a kayak, because
Yeah.
a kayak moves so much in your hook. You just don't have the leverage that you
Yeah.
have in a bass boat. So, being able to have a little more power there and
Right.
hit those fish hard and get them up out of that brush quickly,
Yeah.
that's
And I think the thing that's so important about rod selection, you need the perfect combination of enough tip to feel the bite and enough power to set the hook, but you also don't
right.
want it to be a broomstick. You want almost, when you're fighting the fish, you almost want a parabolic bend. And that 822 NRX is really the best rod I've ever seen with that. It almost fights fish like a
It's
crankbait
amazing.
rod,
It's
but yet
amazing.
still has the backbone to pull them out of like a dock or out of cover. And
Yeah.
it's the most sensitive rod I've ever used. It really is just like a one of a kind, very unique rod.
That's fact. And a lot of guys, Nick, I think a lot of guys don't realize sensitivity, but it matters in drop shot, especially in the cooler months, the cooler water temps, not the months really, but when those water temperatures start dropping, these fish will literally just come up. And I mean, you guys have watched videos of smallmouth spots, whatever, eating a bait. They can literally come up and mouth the bait and you not ever realize. So, thinking that rod doesn't matter in sensitivity, man, you want if I'm throwing a worm, a jig, or a drop shot, or any of these baits where the bite, it's not a reaction bite like a chatterbait or something like that. It's going to be an NRX. I mean,
Yeah.
and I'm not sponsored by those guys. I could care
Yeah.
less, but I want the best possible, most sensitive rod made for those applications, and it matters. I
Right.
mean, and it's a rod, like he said, those rods he's talking about. If you buy that rod, you'll have that rod. You'll hand that down to your grandkids. It's
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
kind of rod. I mean, nothing's gonna take that rod over ever. It's amazing.
Right. Yeah.
Do y'all
It's
still carry football jigs?
yeah, 100%.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I
I
love
love
I
football
love a
jig.
football jig.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how, but because y'all are throwing it different than I definitely have. I was trying to wonder like what techniques are like you can't throw everything. So what are
Yeah.
you not throwing in your
I
lineup
don't
that
I hardly ever crank. I never crank ever. And I feel like I could pick those same fish off sitting on that piece of cover if I know they're there, if I could just sneak a drop shot or a shaky head past them. So I feel like I'm not efficient when I'm crankbaiting because I feel like I'm searching for fish. If I know those fish are there and can see that those fish are there, I feel like I could target them more purposefully with a finesse technique than hoping that I get a cast right on a crankbait. I don't get hung up on the limb as I'm coming through. I'm not a big crankbait fisherman just because I feel like I could make up for that with other techniques. I may throw a jig in there.
I throw everything. I love to crank. I learned a long time ago that there's a lot of ways to get it done, and I mean, I've cranked brush, which, as Nick said, is dangerous.
Yeah, banging it off
Yeah.
brush.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you bang it down into the brush pile and then
Mhm.
stop reel and let
Let
it
it-
float up. I mean,
yeah.
I've caught so
Right.
many big fish doing that.
Yeah.
Lot
there's a-
easier to do from a boat. I used to do that from a boat.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to do from a
Cranking
kayak.
is hard, and I think that's part of why I don't. Cranking is a lot harder from a kayak than it is from a boat.
Oh,
For
it's
sure.
never-
I gave up all my deep cranks. Like I don't
Yeah.
throw anything
Yes.
more than a medium.
It
And I
feels like
might
the
yeah.
yeah. It feels like the crankbait sometimes is pulling you through the water
Mm,
column
yeah.
as opposed
it
to
does.
yeah.
It's the hardest part about kayak fishing is, I think it would be, to me, the two techniques that I truly loved that I hate in a kayak is deep water cranking and punching. Punching to me in a kayak is just
Stuff.
mutiny.
Yeah.
It is. Well, you can get it done. It's just the maneuvering, right? I mean, because once you punch a mat, you got to sit down and pedal to the next spot or whatever whatever
Right.
or paddle, whatever, and it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
It pays off sometimes, but it's
Jerk
tough.
bait. A jerk bait is tough out of a kayak too. I throw it because there's certain situations where
Right.
that's one of the best ways to get a bite. But it's a lot tougher to fish a jerk bait out of a kayak than it is out of a boat, I think.
I'll tell you,
Yeah. Mhm.
most of the baits I've learned in kayak, like when I went from a boat to a kayak, I think I increased and I throw a lot of Loomis rods, unless it's cranking, and then I use St. Croix glass because I like it better, or I used to. But I think like when I got into kayak fishing, I increased the power of every rod I had by one or two in some instances. Even like a jerk bait to me in a bass boat where I was standing up and able to just truly just rip it. I was using like 1 and 2 power Loomis rods. Now I use a 3.
Mm-hmm.
Now I do feel like I lose fish because when you hook one up on a crankbait or a jerk bait and they're jumping and all that. I mean, that 1 power rod used to just be like a noodle. It went to them. They could never sling it. Held on to them forever. But it's tough doing those patterns.
Yep. I lose way too many fish on a kayak on a jerkbait. That is like, it's every time I throw it, I'm like, well, I'm only going to land 50% of the fish that I hook. So better hope it's the good one that I land.
Right.
Well, it's probably those damn mega bass hooks because I
Yeah.
don't know how many fish I always say I'm gonna change out the hooks and then I throw it for a while and then I
Yeah.
lose a fish and I'm like, I should have changed the
Yeah.
hooks.
I actually, it got so bad with the megabass. I mean, they're great jerk baits. They get bites, but it got so bad with them that I actually switched to the Shimano World Minnow. That's my, I won a tournament on Lake George this year on the World Minnow in the spring. And it was, it really, it gets down to the depths that they say. I feel like a lot of times the megabasses run a little bit shallower than they say, which is more important to me because I'm a deep water fisherman. Like I'm fishing jerk baits a lot deeper, but that World Minnow, and it casts a mile. It has this spring loaded weight transfer system, and it just bombs. Like you could throw that thing into the wind. It gets out there.
Never thrown one.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, talking about different baits and stuff like that, but especially on like jerk bait, even on a drop shot, especially with smallmouth. And I think that's why I throw that owner hook so much. Or Gamakatsu's got their whatever that hybrid
Yeah.
series, that G finesse. Whenever you're fishing deep or like even a jerk bait, I went to G finesse treble hooks on all my jerk baits, and my hookup ratio is like amazing now. But I look at that the same way with a drop shot, or if I'm fishing a jig deep, driving that barb, especially in a smallmouth. Smallmouth have such meaty,
Oh yeah.
mouths. getting that bar, you see so many people jump smallmouth off and stuff like that, and I've done it too. I mean, it's going to happen. But I when I'm fishing deep in these lakes, especially loaded with smallmouth and spots, spots have kind of a meatier mouth too. Um, I want what I consider to be a hypodermic needle hook. I want the
Mhm.
hook that basically, like when I barely lay to it, like I have confidence that that barb is just going to go in. Because if the
Right.
barb goes through, most times you're landing
Yep.
that fish.
Right. And that's the hook I used to throw, the when I used to throw a nose hook drop shot, was the Owner Mosquito Light, and that hook is a
Yep.
needle point. And I that's
Yeah.
actually kind of why I was looking for that Owner cover shot. I wanted to see if it had a similar style hook. I mean, the VMC Nico Finesse is great, but it's a little bit of a thicker hook. It's got that coating on it, a little bit of a thicker hook, but it requires a very firm hook set to get it set. And once you have them hooked, they stay on. But the problem is, if you don't get a great hook set, you will lose a few. And it's never usually on the jump. It's more so like I'll be reeling the fish up through the water column, and then all of a sudden it's
Come
just
off.
off. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Have
I've
you
been
tried the red line version yet?
this is the red
The
line.
red line?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. That's the
gotcha.
red line one. Actually, the old one, I used the old one too, the original VMC, and I might have better. I think I had better success, lost less fish on that older one than the red line.
I went to the red line because I used the Nico. That's the hook I
Yeah,
use for Nico
yeah,
and wacky rigging.
mm-hmm,
I think it's something with the barb where it's not like I
yeah,
looked at the barbs on the red line ones, and I don't think the barb is as good as the one on the regular
yeah,
VMC ones. And I
yeah,
went back to the VMC because my hookup ratio went down with the red lines.
yeah.
That's
I
why I was asking.
actually, I think mine did as well. I mean, I don't get me wrong, the red line still catches plenty of fish, but
Yeah.
and I used it all season long and didn't have any real major catastrophes with it. But um, yeah, I think it could be. Maybe it doesn't keep them pinned as well.
Are there any other hooks you guys use besides those two hooks you guys mentioned?
For drop shot, that's it for me.
I know, depending on what I'm doing, like if I'm bed fishing, and I've got trying to put a small crawl in there that I know when they sit there and do that, nibble on it,
Yeah,
that they're getting some hook in their mouth. Um, I use an owner then, but I'll use I don't even know what it's called, but they've got one that's got just a crazy gap.
yeah,
Um, and I base a lot of my hooks based on how much plastic's between the worm and the hook
yep,
itself. If I'm using a Cinco, then yeah, I may use like a finesse wide gap, uh,
yeah,
Gamakatsu, or I mean I play around with my hooks depending on what plastic I'm using. If I'm well, we were at Possum Kingdom with Bass Nation back in June, I think it was. I was taking a drop shot on a baitcaster with 17-pound test, and I was throwing an 8-inch Cinco on a 5/0 Gamakatsu hook, and basically hanging my weight on what I think is a mesquite tree. I don't know, and shaking it in their face, and
yeah,
caught some big ones. So
Wow. 8 inch, huh?
yeah.
yeah, well, it's big fish, big lake, big baits. I don't know.
That's right.
I'll drop shot. I'll drop shot 10-inch worms occasionally. I know Ryan, my buddy Ryan Matalevich that I travel with, he won a tournament down on Lake Murray this year, throwing a 8-inch worm on a drop shot. Um, that second day of the KBF tournament down there that he won was on a big worm on a drop shot. So I will do that. But I don't generally change hooks. I just change this. I like to keep things consistent between all my setups. I use the same braid on all my spinning setups. I use basically the same rod, the same reel. I like to have consistency through my lineup. I'll just change the size of the hook if I'm going to change anything. But
I think
Is
that
there any?
that's
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think that's a big misconception. Like if anybody takes anything away from this, you know, I think guys that have never fished a drop shot, that maybe have a certain style of fishing, if they would apply it to their conditions, if it's 10 foot
Yeah.
of water and it's button brush or whatever, if they typically like to throw a big worm, an 8-inch worm, a 10, whatever it is, I don't care. Apply it to your scenario, your environment, and give the fish a different presentation. I think at the end of the day, in bass fishing as a whole, boat, kayak, I don't care what it is, but the guy that shows them something different a lot of times. I mean, you hear of some crazy wins, like maybe somebody you weren't expecting, or they caught it in a way, they caught their fish and you're like, holy cow, I would have never done that on that lake. Right. Showing fish something different is obviously a thing. It's why, like, when a new bait hits the market, for if you're that guy with it for the first couple of months, you get blessed, so I think the hardest thing is like, I hear guys all the time, oh, I'm never throwing a drop shot. And you might be missing something huge, just because you're thinking it's a spinning rod with 6-pound test when you could be taking your flipping stick with braid. If you think about, I know I fished with a guy down in Harris Chain that was taking braided line, tying it on to I want to say an 1.75 ounce weight, and putting his craw, like a beaver style bait, I don't know what it was, 3 inches above the weight. And he was slinging it up and punching mats. And I mean, he smoked, so there's, now maybe that wouldn't be the conventional drop shot.
Drop
but
punch.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's no different. I mean, there's so many applications to the drop shot and so many different ways you could apply it to your body of water. I think that's where, like, guys that say they've never thrown it, or I would never do that, or, well, I'm not throwing 6-pound test on, blah, blah, blah. I'm over 20-pound big game in a tree, where you could do the same thing with a drop shot. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, for someone, go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
Oh no, please.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, for me, if I'm telling someone that if they've never really fished a drop shot before, think about the chatterbait and how that changed fishing. The chatterbait, you're in constant contact with your lure the entire time you're fishing, and I think that's why it is one of the most popular fishing lures out there. You're constantly feeling, you have a constant feedback of what's going on with your lure. And for someone who doesn't like drop shot fishing, my number one recommendation would be upsize your weight. Try to go to a heavier weight and be in constant contact with your lure, and you'll feel when you get the bite, as opposed to I'm not a fan of the Carolina rig, and that's one of my biggest problems with it. I could never feel like I know what's going on when I'm throwing a Carolina rig. And if you do try throwing a heavier weight, maybe I should take my own advice and throw a heavier weight on a Carolina rig. But if you're not confident in a drop shot, try upsizing your weight. I mean, it doesn't have to be 3/4, because you may not be fishing 30 to 50 feet deep, but try throwing a 1/2 ounce, try throwing a 3/8 ounce, and see if you get that more responsive feedback, similar to a chatterbait, how that gives you a more responsive feedback.
How about line twist? Is there anything you're doing to keep down on that?
I live with it. Braid, yeah. It's still you get line twist though. I mean, I've tried a bunch of different braids. I do get line twist. When I get it, sometimes if I'm fishing deep water, I'll just open my bail, let the drop shot weight fall down, and it'll unswivel itself. But it's never to the point where it really impacts my fishing.
No swingers, no mechanical stuff in there.
No.
I've seen spin shot and the different things, and yeah,
that's extra metal that gets in the way. I think I like just
I agree.
Just a regular Palomar.
More knots to break. There's all kinds of things. 1 knot to fluoro is how I do mine. I will say that, I mean, I have a brand of braid that I live by. It's made by Cast Fishing. It's a saltwater braid. I personally think a high thread count braid that's woven properly, like, I don't have line twist. And I went down I've done a lot of fishing in Florida out on flats and stuff like that. And those guys throw braid. That's all they've ever done. They've been doing it longer than we have. But they throw braid in every situation, and they've been tying fluorocarbon to it for years.
Yep.
They perfected their knots. They hook huge fish without malfunction, breaking lines and stuff like that, other than, gill plates and things cutting the line. But if you get a good high quality braid, first off, it's going to be on your reel pretty much all season. I mean, I know it costs money, but go ahead and buy one good spool of braid. The other big thing is if you're fishing a spinning rod, and I see so many guys still do this. I mean, when you hook up a fish and that drag's pulling, let the drag run. Do not reel against it, because if you reel against that drag, your next cast is just gonna, it'll blow up in that spinning reel. It's and this isn't new information. It's been out forever. But when your drag's running against it, don't reel. Let the fish fight. Let the rod do its thing. Let the reel do what it's supposed to be doing. Trying to horse that fish in when that drag's. When they're taking line, let them run for a second. But I do think I use cast braid, which I really love. That's probably my favorite braid I've ever thrown now. The other one I like a lot is I think it's Suffix, the 832.
That's nice stuff,
I've been really pleased with that braid. But if you'll do those couple of things, then definitely braid on your main line. The line twist thing will go away for you.
100% braid on the main line. I couldn't even think of fishing a drop shot without braid on the main line. It's like
I'll say that for any lure on a spinning reel. So
yeah, literally any spinning reel presentation, braid as a main line. I usually throw 15 to 20 the main line. I throw very long leaders, so that's another thing that I would recommend is if you are, because I use high vis braid on all of my spinning reels. Same. Bright green. So I do.
Yeah, I've been using blue. I love it.
Yeah. Oh, really? Have you been? So, and that's goes back to the line management thing. I could see where my braid is in the water, and I need to be able to see that it's not 100 yards to my right, floating somewhere where I don't want it to be.
And that kind of goes for all techniques, whether you're throwing a jig or a shaky head. I mean, line management. I throw probably a 12 to 15 foot leader.
Yeah, I throw. Yeah, so I always do 4 arm lengths, which is about 24 feet of leader. 24 feet. And also the other thing is if you break off, you could just retie and you don't have to worry about tying a new leader. People that throw little 5 to 6 foot leaders, if you break off once, you lost half your leader.
You're done.
Yeah.
And if you're tying an FJ knot, you're down for a few minutes.
Do you use an FJ knot?
I don't anymore.
Okay.
I had some guys. I don't even know what the knot I throw, but you take your mono and you double it over.
Yeah.
You put your braid through and go
7.
And depending on what pound test is depending on how many wraps I do. But you go if I'm using 8-pound test, I'll go 5 wraps down, 5 wraps back, back through the hole and cinch it up. I love that. It's been I've never broke at the knot.
Alberto?
Me neither. It's the Alberto.
I think it is.
That's what I use.
That's what I use too.
Now, if I use heavier line, unless I'm trying to protect the line, that's by covering it with braid. You can get away with less knots to minimize, but the smaller fluorocarbon you use, and depending on what your main line is, the more wraps if you pull on it and it pulls through, you need to do more wraps.
Yeah.
And some of that's trial and error.
Yeah. On the Alberto, I use 7 for everything. There's every technique I use, or every weight line, all the way down from 6 all the way to up to 15, 20. I'll use 7 wraps up, 7 wraps back. So that helps. That covered that's just the number that I think gives you a good protection on either end of the spectrum.
There you go. 7 for the win. I like it. So, is there anything we missed?
Oh, I'm sure there is. But
Yeah.
but
There's always something.
Yeah. All right. Well,
I mean, there's a lot of guys that get into, you know, and not to drag this out, but you know, there's some validity to the guys that use the cylinder lates that are really long. You know, where they're sitting there using that weight to kind of now maybe somebody that's starting out in the drop shot world, it's a good technique to start out with because you don't have to wonder so much. Like I feel like I can do the same thing with my teardrop weight by just letting my bait fall down and bringing it back up. But there are a lot of guys that like those, you know, those long cylinder weights.
Yeah.
You know, I don't. There's the argument of what gets hung up more or less. Whatever, they all get hung up at the end of the day. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just fishing. But
Yep. Yeah. For me on that,
other
it's
than that, I mean,
yeah. For me on the cylinder versus teardrop, I'm teardrop 100% of the time, just because I feel like it's a smaller profile going down. I want the smallest
Same.
profile I can have on the drop shot.
I will tell, you know, the guys, I don't know if you guys can see this weight, but this weight has like the,
Yep.
it's blurry, but it's got where you know, you pull the line into it and then lock it up. A lot of guys will just do that and they'll be like, man, my weights fall off all the time. And there's the ones that have an eye where you actually hard tie it to the weight. I still like that little V where you pull the line up into it. And then I'll put one knot on top of it.
Yeah.
But if my weight gets hung, a lot of times that V will cut the line. Now I am losing a weight, but at least I get my hook and everything back.
Yeah.
So I do like that style of weight
Same.
more than I like the eyelet style that you tie. Because when you hang up an eyelet, there's no telling where
It's
it's going to
gone.
break at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other advantage of that the cinch-in style weight is drop shots are a mess when you net a fish. Like even I don't care what net you have, it gets through every loop. And what I do with the cylinder with the cinch-on weight is just pull it off the end of the line and just pull the line right out of the net, and then you're good to go. You're right back at them.
That's a great point, Nick.
Yeah.
I don't know how many times I've had that happen.
Yeah.
It'll wrap around 1,000 times if it can.
See, hopefully somebody listened to the very end just to get that. You know, just that one little thing could be a big deal.
The juice is
Yeah.
at the end.
Save you a lot of trouble for sure.
Yeah.
There's a
All
lot
right.
of good
Well,
details.
Nick. Oh, go ahead, Nick. Kurt. Sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying there's a lot of good details we got in this episode.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, Nick, it's late over on the East Coast, but we want to give you a chance to shout out any of your sponsors. Anybody that makes fishing easier for you, man.
Yeah, for sure. Black Hall Outfitters up in Connecticut. They're a kayak dealer up in Connecticut.
Yeah.
They get my Hobie rigged up for me. Ted, he does all the rigging for them. He does a fantastic job. Has my kayak dialed in perfectly for all of these scenarios that I'm throwing these drop shots in, and I really like to thank them. They do a lot of great work for me and make it easier to get on the water. Know that my equipment is locked in place. So
cool.
Them and
Tom?
Enduro Power.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, and
No,
Enduro Power.
go ahead.
Yeah, Enduro Power batteries as well. They lithium batteries. They keep me powered on the water. So I'd like to give them a shout out as well.
Cool.
Yep.
Tom, how about you?
Dugout Bait and Tackle. They kind of grew up with the guys there. My hometown shop, and they do an awesome job of, you know, from rigging the kayaks to still being that small field bait shop that carries a lot of cool baits that you can't get anywhere else. So that's my guys.
Nope. Well, we appreciate y'all being on. Appreciate everybody listening. We'll see y'all again at the next episode. See y'all next week.
Thanks,
All right,
Dan. Thanks,
guys.
Kurt, for having us on.